The winter of 1942 descended on England like a shroud, cold and gray and suffocating. RAF Fighter Command sat in its operations rooms beneath the frozen earth, watching the green glow of cathode ray tubes with the intensity of men reading scripture. They were losing. Not in the air, not always, but in the invisible war that preceded every dogfight, every bombing raid, every desperate scramble. The Luftwaffe had learned to read British radar like a book. German pilots knew when chain home stations swept the channel, knew the rhythm of the pulses, knew when to climb or dive to exploit the blind spots in coverage. Intelligence reports from captured aircrew confirmed what the operators already suspected. The enemy understood the game. They had cracked the pattern. And in war, a pattern is a death sentence. But somewhere in the labyrinth of British scientific intelligence, a different kind of mind was turning over the problem. Not the mind of a pilot or a general, but of physicists and engineers who understood that deception is simply physics applied with imagination. R.V. Jones, the young scientific intelligence officer whose quiet brilliance had already identified German navigational beams, gathered his team at the Air Ministry. The question was simple. If the Germans knew how British radar worked, could that knowledge be weaponized against them? Could certainty itself become a vulnerability? The answer arrived not as a thunderclap, but as a whisper, elegant and surgical. They would not hide the radar. They would lie with it. They would broadcast false truths so convincing, so precisely calibrated to German expectations, that the Luftwaffe would fly blind while believing they could see. The technology was called meaconing, a term derived from the old naval practice of false beacons. But this was no crude jamming operation. The British would capture German navigational signals, delay them by microseconds, and retransmit them from false locations. Bomber crews navigating by radio beam would find themselves miles off course, their instruments whispering coordinates that pointed toward empty fields instead of London, toward the North Sea instead of Coventry. Coupled with this, a more audacious trick, false radar echoes. By transmitting synchronized pulses that mimicked legitimate returns, British operators could conjure phantom formations, ghost squadrons that appeared on Luftwaffe plotting tables as real as steel and aluminum. The Germans would vector night fighters toward nothing. They would scramble interceptors to meet bombers that did not exist. And all the while, the actual RAF formations would slip through gaps in coverage, unseen and lethal. The first tests were conducted in absolute secrecy, in underground bunkers where the only sound was the hum of vacuum tubes and the scratch of pencils on plotting paper. Engineers rehearsed the timing with obsessive precision. A delay of 3 milliseconds could mean the difference between a believable deception and obvious fakery. The signals had to match German frequencies exactly. The phantom returns had to obey the physics of real aircraft: altitude, speed, formation density. It was theater performed in electromagnetic spectrum, and the audience was armed. By January 1943, the system was operational. Code-named Moonshine for the reflector-based element and Mandrel for the screening jamming component, the combined operation represented something unprecedented. Not merely a technical countermeasure, but a psychological weapon. The British were about to teach the Luftwaffe that certainty was an illusion, that every blip on a scope could be a lie, and that the invisible battlefield was far stranger and more treacherous than the sky itself. The Luftwaffe had built its doctrine on speed and certainty. From the blitzkrieg over Poland to the night raids on Britain, German tactical superiority rested on one principle: information dominance. Their Freya and Würzburg radar sets were technological marvels, capable of tracking formations at ranges that stunned Allied planners. Their Liechtenstein airborne intercept radar allowed night fighters to close on RAF bombers in total darkness, guided by electronic echoes invisible to human eyes. And their signals intelligence network, the Funkhorkdienst, listened to every British transmission, cataloging frequencies, identifying units, constructing order-of-battle assessments with Teutonic thoroughness. By late 1942, the Germans believed they had mapped the entire architecture of British air defense. They knew where the radar stations stood. They knew the coastal gaps. They knew the rotation schedules of squadrons. Knowledge, they believed, was armor, but knowledge is only armor when it remains true, And in February 1943, the truth began to bend. It started subtly. A Ju-88 night fighter, vectored by ground control toward a reported bomber stream over East Anglia, found empty sky. The pilot reported back, no contact. Controllers assumed operator error, perhaps atmospheric interference. 3 nights later, another miss. Then another. Patterns emerged, but they made no sense. Bombers appeared on German scopes in formations too dense, too perfect, flying courses that changed without reason. Interceptors raced toward contacts that evaporated. And when actual RAF formations were detected, smaller, scattered, seemingly disorganized, they slipped through defenses before fighters could engage. Luftwaffe intelligence officers in Berlin pored over loss reports and mission logs. The data contradicted itself. British radar seemed simultaneously more powerful and less coherent. It was as if the electromagnetic spectrum had become haunted. What the Germans did not know, could not know, was that British listening posts had identified every operational Freya and Würzburg station along the coast. They had mapped German radar frequencies down to the kilohertz, and now, using high-powered transmitters positioned along the English coastline, RAF 80 Wing was beaming false returns directly into German scopes. When a real RAF formation prepared to cross the channel, moonshine operators would create a phantom fleet 30 miles away, a ghost armada reflecting radar pulses with such fidelity that German controllers vectored fighters toward the mirage. By the time the deception was recognized, the actual bombers had crossed into occupied airspace, their approach masked by mandrel jamming screens that turned German radar displays into fields of static snow. It was misdirection on an industrial scale, a magic trick performed with kilowatts and trigonometry. The psychological effect was immediate and corrosive. Luftwaffe pilots began to doubt their instruments. Controllers hesitated before issuing vectors, second-guessing returns that might be real or might be British phantoms. The Germans called it Geisterstaffeln, ghost squadrons. Some crews reported formations that appeared on scope but produced no engine noise, no exhaust flames, no physical presence. Others described bombers that seemed to multiply mid-flight, splitting into duplicate contacts that behaved identically. Debriefs became exercises in confusion. A Bf-110 pilot over the North Sea swore he had tracked a Lancaster for 12 minutes, only to have it vanish the moment he achieved visual range. Another crew reported intercepting a formation that, upon approach, dissolved into 3 separate groups flying in different directions. The Reich Air Ministry issued directives demanding better discipline, better training, better focus. But discipline could not solve a problem rooted in physics. The British had not merely countered German radar, they had turned it into a weapon against itself, a system that now fed its operators a diet of plausible lies, and the Luftwaffe, for all its technical sophistication, had no conceptual framework for what was happening. They understood jamming, they understood evasion, but they did not understand deception at this level. Deception so precise it mimicked reality, so persistent it eroded trust in perception itself. By spring 1943, German night fighter effectiveness had declined by nearly 40%. Bomber streams crossed the channel with impunity. And in the operations rooms beneath England, young men watched phosphor screens and smiled coldly, knowing they had discovered something the enemy had not anticipated, that in the invisible war, the most devastating weapon was not power but doubt. To understand how the deception worked, one must first understand what radar sees. It does not see aircraft. It sees ghosts, electromagnetic echoes bouncing off metal skin, delayed by nanoseconds, their strength inversely proportional to distance. A radar operator does not observe reality. He interprets reflections, translated into blips on a screen. The human brain fills in the rest, constructing a narrative of altitude, speed, heading. But that narrative depends entirely on trust. Trust that the blip represents an object, that the timing is accurate, that the physics are consistent. Break that trust, subtly, systematically, and the entire system collapses into uncertainty. This was the operational philosophy behind moonshine and mandrel, and it required technical virtuosity that bordered on art. The moonshine apparatus itself was deceptively simple. A receiver tuned to German Freya frequencies, coupled to a high-gain transmitter and a rotating antenna array mounted on lorries positioned along the coast. When a German radar pulse struck the British coastline, Moonshine receivers captured it, amplified it, and retransmitted it with a carefully calculated delay. The delay was the key. Too short, and the echo would appear too close, obviously false. Too long, and it would fall outside believable parameters. But calibrated precisely, between 2 and 5 milliseconds, the reflected pulse created a phantom contact that appeared to German operators as a formation of aircraft 30 to 50 miles away from the real bomber stream. The Germans saw what they expected to see, a large formation, coherent, approaching on a predictable vector. They scrambled fighters. They issued warnings. They prepared defenses. And all the while, the actual bombers slipped through elsewhere, hidden in the noise. Mandrel, the complementary system, was even more insidious. Rather than creating false targets, it created false blindness. High-powered jamming transmitters broadcast noise across German radar frequencies, but not uniformly. That would be too obvious. Instead, Mandrel created holes in coverage, deliberate gaps in the jamming where German radar could function normally. The Germans, detecting these gaps, would naturally concentrate their attention there, believing they had found a window through British countermeasures. But the gaps were bait. The real bomber streams flew through the jammed sectors, invisible behind walls of electromagnetic static, while German controllers fixated on the clear zones where phantom formations, courtesy of Moonshine, danced and multiplied. It was a two-layer deception. The lie that drew attention, and the blindness that concealed truth. Together, they created a tactical environment where the Luftwaffe's most sophisticated technology became a liability. Feeding commanders information, that was worse than useless. It was convincing fiction. The technical crews who operated these systems were not soldiers in any traditional sense. They were university physicists, radio engineers, telecommunications specialists pulled from civilian life and thrust into a war fought with oscilloscopes and signal generators. They worked in shifts, monitoring frequencies, adjusting power levels, timing transmissions to microsecond precision. A mistake, a mistimed pulse, an incorrectly calibrated delay could expose the entire operation. The Germans were not fools. Their signals intelligence was formidable. If they detected anomalies, they would investigate, adapt, develop countermeasures. So the British operators became ghosts themselves, invisible technicians waging a war the enemy could not see, in a domain where victory left no wreckage, no craters, only confusion and doubt. They kept logs in pencil, marking successful spoofs with quiet satisfaction. They drank tea and smoked cigarettes and adjusted dials with hands steady as surgeons. And night after night, they rewrote the electromagnetic sky. What made the operation sustainable was its simplicity. Unlike complex cryptographic efforts or covert agent networks, Moonshine and Mandrel required no elaborate cover stories, no diplomatic maneuvering. The Germans could detect the jamming, they did detect it, but detecting deception is not the same as understanding it. Luftwaffe technicians knew the British were interfering with radar, but they interpreted it as crude jamming, a brute force approach typical of an adversary desperate to blind superior technology. They did not suspect that the interference was intelligent, targeted, designed not to obscure but to deceive. And so the deception held, month after month, because the Germans made the fatal error of underestimating British scientific ingenuity. They believed themselves the masters of radio warfare. They did not realize they were being played like a phonograph. Their own systems turned into instruments broadcasting a symphony of lies. By March 1943, the cumulative effects of the radar deception became statistically undeniable. RAF Bomber Command missions over the Ruhr, the most heavily defended airspace in Europe, showed a dramatic decrease in interception rates. Where previously 1 in 12 bombers could expect contact with night fighters, the rate dropped to 1 in 23. German flak batteries, reliant on radar-guided predictors, fired at phantoms or missed actual formations by hundreds of meters. Post-war analysis would reveal that between February and July 1943, moonshine and mandrill operations contributed to a reduction in bomber command losses of approximately 18%, over 200 aircraft and 2,000 aircrew saved by invisible trickery. But the numbers told only part of the story. The deeper impact was psychological, moral, a slow erosion of German confidence in their technological superiority. Luftwaffe pilots began to report phenomena that their commanders dismissed as exhaustion or combat stress. Contacts that changed altitude impossibly fast, formations that split and recombined in defiance of aerodynamics, bombers that appeared on scope but never on horizon. One night fighter ace, Heinz Wolfgang Schnaufer, noted in his log a strange encounter over the North Sea. His Liechtenstein set tracked a bomber for 9 minutes. Steady bearing, decreasing range, all parameters consistent with interception. He closed to 1 kilometer, 500 meters. Then the contact vanished. Not gradually, but instantaneously, as if the aircraft had ceased to exist. He circled, searching. Empty sky, empty scope. He returned to base in silence, filed a perfunctory report, and never spoke of it again. Such experiences accumulated, unshared, festering in the collective psyche of the night fighter force. The invisible enemy was no longer just British bombers. It was reality itself. German technical intelligence, meanwhile, struggled to explain the phenomenon. They captured downed RAF aircraft and found no new equipment, no exotic transmitters. They interrogated prisoners who spoke of increased jamming, but revealed nothing of phantom tactics. The Reich Air Ministry convened panels of scientists and engineers, demanding answers. Some theorized that the British had developed airborne radar far more powerful than previously assessed. Others suggested atmospheric anomalies, ionospheric reflection creating false echoes. A few whispered about deliberate deception, but the idea seemed too elaborate, too resource-intensive. Why would the British invest such effort when they could simply jam? The answer, that deception was cheaper and more effective than jamming, that it exploited German trust in their instruments rather than blinding them outright, never gained traction. The Luftwaffe, like all institutions, suffered from doctrinal inertia. They had built a system predicated on radar supremacy. Acknowledging that the system had been compromised would require admitting that British science had outmaneuvered German engineering. And that admission in 1943 was ideologically intolerable. So the Germans adapted within the limits of their understanding. They increased standing patrols, reducing reliance on radar vectors. They trained pilots to trust visual identification over electronic cues. They rotated radar frequencies, hoping to escape British interference. And these measures had some effect. Moonshine operators had to adjust constantly, tracking frequency changes, recalibrating delays. But the fundamental vulnerability remained. As long as the Luftwaffe depended on radar for situational awareness, and as long as British operators could intercept and manipulate those radar signals, the deception would hold. It was an asymmetric advantage, invisible to historiography, hidden in classified reports, but decisive in its cumulative impact. The RAF had not won air superiority through better fighters or braver pilots, though both helped. They had won it by making the enemy doubt what he saw, by turning German precision into German paralysis, and perhaps most remarkably, the operation remained secret for months. German intelligence never fully penetrated the Moonshine network. British security was airtight. Operators were compartmentalized, briefed on need-to-know basis, forbidden from discussing their work even with other RAF personnel. The equipment itself was disguised as standard jamming apparatus, the technical principles buried in classified annexes. When the war ended and documents were declassified, historians would marvel at the elegance of the scheme. But in 1943, the men and women who executed it simply did their jobs, night after night, watching scopes and adjusting dials and knowing that somewhere over the channel, German pilots were chasing ghosts. The electromagnetic spectrum had become a battlefield as real as Normandy or Stalingrad, and the British had claimed it through nothing more than clever physics and relentless precision. The radar trick had fooled the Luftwaffe for months, and by the time they understood what had been done to them, the war in the air had already shifted irrevocably. The human cost of the deception was measured not in blood, but in psychology, in the slow unraveling of certainty that afflicted both sides. For the Luftwaffe night fighter crews, the experience was maddening. These were not novices. They were among Germany's most skilled aviators, men who had survived hundreds of sorties, who could interpret radar returns by instinct, who knew the sound of Merlin engines in darkness. But now their instruments lied. Controllers vectored them toward contacts that evaporated. Ground radar showed formations that their airborne sets could not confirm. Some pilots began to suffer from a peculiar form of combat fatigue, not fear of death, but fear of irrelevance, the gnawing suspicion that they were participants in a charade, hunting phantoms while real bombers burned German cities unmolested. On the British side, the operators of Moonshine and Mandrel experienced a different kind of strain. They fought a war without catharsis, without visible enemy, without the adrenaline clarity of combat. Their victories were statistical abstracts, a percentage point decrease in interception rates, a bomber stream that returned intact. They never saw the German pilots circling in confusion, never heard the frantic radio chatter as controllers tried to reconcile contradictory data. They worked in underground rooms lit by fluorescent tubes, breathing recycled air, their only connection to the war a green phosphor glow and the steady pulse of transmitted signals. It was warfare as bureaucracy, as engineering problem, as silent duel fought in frequencies invisible to human perception. And yet it required a peculiar kind of courage, the discipline to maintain perfection night after night, knowing that a single error could unravel months of deception. The operational tempo was relentless. Each mission required hours of preparation. Before every Bomber Command raid, Moonshine crews received detailed briefings, the true course and altitude of the bomber stream, the locations of German radar stations, the frequencies currently in use. They coordinated with Mandrel jamming aircraft, converted bombers flying along the coast, broadcasting noise to create the coverage gaps. Timing was synchronized to the second. If the phantom formation appeared too early, German controllers would have time to reassess. Too late, and the real bombers would be detected before the deception could take effect. The operators worked with stopwatches and slide rules, calculating propagation delays, adjusting for atmospheric conditions, accounting for the curvature of the Earth. It was navigation by physics, and the margin for error was measured in microseconds, and always there was the threat of German adaptation. British intelligence monitored Luftwaffe communications obsessively, searching for signs that the deception had been compromised. They analyzed loss reports, looking for patterns that might indicate the enemy had developed countermeasures. They studied captured equipment, checking for modifications that might detect false echoes. R.V. Jones himself reviewed intercepts weekly, searching for linguistic clues, a change in terminology, a new technical term, anything suggesting the Germans understood what was being done to them. The fear was not merely that the deception would fail, but that it would fail catastrophically, that the Germans would turn the technique against the RAF, flooding British scopes with false targets at a critical moment. In the silent war of electromagnetic deception, there were no front lines, no safe positions. Every advantage was temporary, every success provisional, yet the operation held because it exploited a fundamental asymmetry in how humans process information. The Germans expected jamming. They had developed doctrine and countermeasures for it. They expected evasion. They had trained for it. But they did not expect their instruments to lie convincingly, to present false data that obeyed all the rules of physics, that behaved exactly as real aircraft would behave. The deception worked because it was plausible, because it confirmed German assumptions about British capabilities while subtly undermining German effectiveness. It was a form of psychological warfare waged through technology, and it succeeded because the Luftwaffe never questioned the premise that their radar, properly operated, told the truth. They believed in their machines with the faith of engineers, and that faith, exploited with sufficient subtlety, became their greatest vulnerability. The British had not defeated German radar. They had made it a collaborator in its own deception, a tool that whispered lies so seductive that even its masters could not distinguish them from reality. The story of the radar deception cannot be told without understanding R.V. Jones, the man who orchestrated much of Britain's scientific intelligence effort. Reginald Victor Jones was 28 years old in 1940. A physicist by training, a skeptic by temperament, a man who believed that war was won not by courage alone, but by superior information ruthlessly applied. He had joined the Air Ministry's intelligence staff with a mandate to investigate German technological developments, and he approached the task with the methodical intensity of a detective solving a murder. He collected fragments, intercepted radio signals, prisoner interrogations, reconnaissance photographs, technical manuals recovered from crash sites. From these fragments, he reconstructed entire systems, the Knickerbein navigational beams that guided German bombers, the X-Jarret precision targeting system, the radar networks that protected occupied Europe. And having reconstructed them, he devised ways to subvert them. Jones understood something fundamental that many military officers did not: that technology is not neutral, that every system contains vulnerabilities, and that those vulnerabilities can be exploited not through brute force, but through precision and imagination. When he learned that the Germans were using radio beams to navigate, he did not propose jamming them into uselessness, too obvious, too easily countered. Instead, he suggested bending the beams, transmitting false signals that would guide German bombers away from their targets. When he discovered the characteristics of German radar, he did not recommend destroying the stations. Too difficult, too costly. Instead, he proposed making them unreliable, feeding them data that was almost correct, but fatally misleading. His genius lay in understanding that in technical warfare, perception mattered more than reality, and that an enemy who trusted compromised instruments was more vulnerable than one who knew himself blind. The development of moonshine emerged directly from Jones's analytical framework. In late 1942, he received reports from RAF pilots describing increased German radar effectiveness. Luftwaffe night fighters were achieving intercepts with disturbing regularity, even in adverse weather, even against formations employing evasive routing. Jones tasked his team with a systematic analysis of German radar capabilities, pulling together intelligence from multiple sources: signals intercepts that revealed radar frequencies, prisoner statements describing operational procedures, mathematical modeling of radar range and resolution. The picture that emerged was troubling. German radar was more sophisticated than previously assessed, and the Luftwaffe had integrated it into a comprehensive air defense system that was claiming an unsustainable percentage of British bombers. Something had to be done, and jamming alone was insufficient. The German systems were too robust, too well defended, too adaptable. Jones convened a working group of physicists and engineers from the Telecommunications Research Establishment, the radar development laboratory that had pioneered British microwave technology. He posed the problem plainly. Given that we know German radar frequencies and characteristics, given that we can intercept their signals, how can we turn their radar against them? The discussion ranged over multiple sessions, exploring possibilities both practical and exotic. Some suggested overwhelming the German systems with high-power jamming, rejected as too resource-intensive. Others proposed airborne decoys that would mimic bomber radar signatures, promising but technically complex. Then someone, records do not specify who, suggested the simplest, most elegant solution: just send their signals back to them with a delay. Make them see what isn't there. The idea hung in the air for a moment, its implications unfolding like a flower. It was not jamming. It was not evasion. It was deception at the level of physics itself. Within weeks, prototype equipment was assembled. Engineers calculated optimal delay times, power levels, antenna configurations. They tested the system against captured German radar sets, confirming that false echoes could be generated with sufficient fidelity to fool experienced operators. By January 1943, the first operational moonshine stations were deployed along the English coast, positioned to reflect signals from known Freya locations across the Channel. Jones personally supervised the initial trials. standing in operations rooms at RAF Fighter Command, watching as German night fighters were vectored toward empty sky while actual bomber formations crossed into Europe unmolested. The results exceeded expectations. The deception worked not occasionally but consistently, night after night, because it exploited the fundamental architecture of radar, that it sees not objects but echoes, and that echoes can be manufactured. Jones authorized immediate expansion of the program. By spring, a dozen moonshine stations were operational, coordinated through a central control that synchronized transmissions with bomber routes and mandrel jamming patterns. The electromagnetic battlefield had been remade, and the Germans did not even know they were fighting on it. What the Luftwaffe experienced, night after night through the spring and summer of 1943, was not simply tactical failure but epistemological crisis, a breakdown in the relationship between observation and reality. Their radar operators were competent professionals, trained to interpret returns with speed and accuracy. But competence is predicated on consistency, on the assumption that the instruments report truth. When that assumption collapses, competence becomes irrelevant. A radar operator watching his scope sees a formation, altitude 4,000 meters, heading 095 degrees, speed 350 kilometers per hour, range decreasing. He reports to the controller. Fighters are vectored. They climb to intercept. They reach the coordinates. Nothing. Empty sky. The operator rechecks his scope. The formation is still there, still descending steadily, still on course. But the fighters report no visual contact, no radar contact, no engine noise. The formation is a ghost, and the operator, staring at his screen, feels something fundamental crack. He no longer knows what he is seeing. This was not paranoia or failure of nerve. It was the rational response to an irrational situation, one that the Germans could not adequately explain because they lacked the conceptual framework. They understood electronic warfare as a binary. Either radar worked or it was jammed. They had not imagined a third possibility, that radar could work perfectly, producing clear, consistent returns that were nonetheless false. The British had exploited a cognitive blind spot, a gap in German doctrine that assumed enemy countermeasures would always be detectable as interference rather than deception. And because the Germans could not conceptualize what was being done to them, they could not counter it. They issued directives emphasizing visual confirmation, reducing reliance on electronic vectors. But visual confirmation was impossible in overcast conditions, in darkness, across the vast empty expanses of the North Sea. Radar had made night interception possible. Without it, the Luftwaffe night fighter force reverted to near helplessness, waiting for bombers to cross the coast before attempting contact, by which point the formations had dispersed, and defensive jamming made pursuit almost futile. Some German officers began to suspect deliberate deception, but they could not prove it, and institutional momentum favored simpler explanations. Atmospheric interference became the default rationalization. Unusual ionospheric conditions creating false echoes, a phenomenon known but rare. Maintenance standards were questioned. Perhaps radar sets were degrading, calibration drifting out of spec. Operator training was scrutinized. Perhaps fatigue or inexperience was causing misidentification. These explanations were comforting because they suggested correctable problems, technical or procedural failures that could be fixed with better discipline or upgraded equipment. The alternative, that the British had developed a systematic capability to manipulate German radar at will, was too destabilizing to accept. It implied a level of scientific sophistication and operational coordination that contradicted the prevailing German assessment of British technical competence. So the Luftwaffe looked inward, seeking to fix problems that did not exist, while the actual vulnerability remained unaddressed. British intelligence monitored this confusion with satisfaction tinged by caution. Intercepted German communications showed frustration, bewilderment, declining morale among night fighter crews. But they also showed adaptation. The Germans were increasing the density of radar coverage, deploying more stations to cross-check returns. They were experimenting with new frequencies, trying to escape British interference. They were training operators to identify anomalies, returns that moved too uniformly, formations that maintained impossible precision. The moonshine operators had to evolve in response, introducing random variations in phantom formations, deliberately adding errors to make the false contacts more convincing. It became a feedback loop, an invisible arms race where each side adapted to the other's adaptations, where success was measured not in destroyed aircraft but in sustained confusion, in keeping the enemy uncertain just long enough for the real bombers to complete their missions and return home. And through it all, the killing continued. Real bombers still fell to flak, to unlucky interceptions, to mechanical failure. Real aircrew died in darkness, their aircraft disintegrating over hostile territory, their names added to casualty lists that grew longer each month. The radar deception did not end the air war. It merely shifted the odds, marginally, persistently, saving a percentage of bombers that would otherwise have been lost. To the crews themselves, the deception was invisible. They knew only that interception rates had declined, that the nights seemed slightly less lethal, that more of them were coming home. They did not know why, could not know, because the operation remained classified at the highest levels. They flew through phantom-haunted skies, protected by ghosts they would never see, by engineers and physicists whose names they would never learn. The radar trick saved lives by the hundreds, and those saved would never know they owed their survival to a handful of operators in coastal bunkers, adjusting dials with hands steady as surgeons, broadcasting lies into the German night. By summer 1943, the tactical situation over Europe had shifted decisively, though not for reasons immediately apparent to historians focusing solely on aircraft production or pilot training. Bomber command losses, which had peaked in April at nearly 6% per mission, declined steadily through May and June. The reasons cited in contemporary RAF analysis included improved routing, better defensive tactics, and the introduction of new electronic countermeasures. All true, but all secondary to the cumulative effect of systematic radar deception. The Luftwaffe night fighter force, which had grown to over 600 operational aircraft by mid-1943, found itself increasingly ineffective despite numerical superiority. German commanders attributed this to dispersed British formations and heavy jamming, failing to recognize that the jamming itself was coordinated with deception operations designed to fragment and misdirect German responses. The moonshine system had evolved considerably from its initial deployment. Early operations used fixed coastal stations transmitting simple delayed echoes, effective but limited in scope. By summer, mobile units mounted on trucks allowed rapid repositioning, making it difficult for German signals intelligence to map the transmitter locations. More sophisticated timing circuits introduced variability into the phantom formations. Individual aircraft within the false formation would exhibit slightly different speeds and altitudes, mimicking the natural dispersion of real bomber streams. British operators even programmed simulated evasive maneuvers, making phantom formations react to German fighter approaches with course changes and altitude adjustments. The goal was not perfect realism, but plausibility, creating enough verisimilitude that German controllers could not reliably distinguish truth from fabrication. Complementing moonshine, the Mandrel screening operation expanded dramatically. What had begun as a handful of converted bombers flying jamming patrols became a coordinated fleet of over 30 aircraft, supplemented by ground-based transmitters. The jamming was no longer uniform but sculpted, creating corridors of clear reception that German radar could exploit. Corridors that British planners ensured were filled with phantom contacts rather than real bombers. The actual bomber streams flew through the jammed sectors, invisible behind walls of noise, while German controllers fixated on the clear zones where moonshine-generated formations danced and multiplied. It was electromagnetic choreography on a massive scale, requiring minute-by-minute coordination between jamming aircraft, coastal transmitters, bomber routes, and intelligence updates on German radar dispositions. The operational complexity was staggering, yet it functioned night after night with clockwork precision. The human element behind this machinery deserves emphasis. The moonshine stations were staffed by members of 80 Wing, RAF Signals, a unit that existed in the shadow world between regular military operations and scientific research. Personnel were drawn from technical backgrounds, radio amateurs, telecommunications engineers, physics students, individuals who understood electromagnetic propagation and could troubleshoot complex equipment under pressure. They worked 12-hour shifts in damp concrete bunkers, monitoring oscilloscopes and adjusting transmitter settings. Their only connection to the war, a stream of operational orders and the knowledge that somewhere overhead, bombers depended on their precision. They were forbidden from discussing their work, forbidden from keeping detailed personal records, told only that what they did was vital and classified. Most were in their 20s, young enough to feel invincible, old enough to understand consequences. They smoked endless cigarettes, drank institutional tea, and performed technical miracles with equipment that was temperamental, occasionally unreliable, and absolutely critical. The Germans, meanwhile, struggled with an intelligence failure more profound than tactical surprise. Their signals intercept service, the Funkhorchdienst, had detected British jamming operations early in the war and developed reasonably effective countermeasures. But detecting moonshine required recognizing that what appeared to be legitimate radar returns were in fact retransmitted echoes, a distinction that demanded both technical sophistication and conceptual imagination. German analysis focused on identifying the jamming transmitters, mapping their locations, developing filters to screen out noise. They never systematically investigated the possibility that some of the returns they were seeing were not merely obscured by jamming but actively fabricated. The idea that the British would invest such resources in deception, rather than jamming or direct electronic attack, fell outside German doctrinal assumptions. And so the Funkhorchdienst analyzed the wrong problem with impressive technical competence, producing detailed reports on British jamming tactics while the actual vulnerability went unrecognized. It was a masterclass in how institutional assumptions can blind even sophisticated adversaries to novel threats. The deception's sustainability depended on an infrastructure that extended far beyond the transmitter stations themselves. At the heart of the operation sat the intelligence apparatus that made informed deception possible. The ability to know, in near real time where German radar stations were located, what frequencies they used, and how their operators responded to various signals. This intelligence came from multiple sources, woven together into a comprehensive picture that was updated daily. RAF photographic reconnaissance flights mapped coastal radar installations, identifying antenna types and orientations. Ground observation networks in occupied Europe, resistance cells equipped with basic radio knowledge, reported on radar activity and station locations. Most critically, signals intelligence from Bletchley Park provided decrypted Luftwaffe communications, revealing not just technical parameters but operational doctrine, how German controllers vectored fighters, what formations they prioritized, how they responded to jamming. This intelligence fusion was coordinated through the Air Ministry's Assistant Directorate of Intelligence, Science, the organization headed by R.V. Jones. His team maintained detailed technical files on every known German radar installation, location, frequency range, power output, operational patterns. They tracked modifications and upgrades, noting when new equipment appeared or when existing stations altered their operating procedures. This information flowed to 80 Wing headquarters, where mission planners used it to design each night's deception. If a new Freya station was detected near Cherbourg, moonshine operators would adjust their transmission angles to ensure coverage. If German signals intelligence showed awareness of a particular jamming frequency, Mandrel aircraft would shift to alternates. The operation was dynamic, responsive, a continuous adaptation to an enemy who was himself adapting, though without full understanding of what he was adapting to. The technical challenge of maintaining this deception across months of operations cannot be overstated. Radar is fundamentally a timing system. It measures the interval between transmitted pulse and received echo to calculate distance. For moonshine to work, the delay introduced by reception, processing, and retransmission had to produce an echo that appeared to originate from a location 30 to 50 miles from the actual bomber stream. This required delays in the range of 200 to 400 microseconds, millionths of a second. But radar pulses themselves last only a few microseconds, and the timing had to be precise to within fractions of that duration. Too much drift and the echo would blur, becoming recognizable as artificial. Too little consistency, and the phantom formation would appear to jump erratically across the scope, triggering suspicion. The equipment used vacuum tube delay lines, devices that stored electrical pulses temporarily before releasing them, technology at the absolute cutting edge of 1943 capabilities. These circuits were temperamental, sensitive to temperature and humidity, requiring constant calibration. Operators kept detailed logs of atmospheric conditions, adjusting delay settings to compensate for propagation variations caused by weather fronts and seasonal changes. Moreover, the physics of radar reflection imposed constraints that operators had to respect to maintain plausibility. A real aircraft reflects radar energy omnidirectionally but with greatest intensity in certain aspects. Head-on and broadside produce stronger returns than oblique angles. Moonshine transmitters had to account for this, modulating their output power to mimic the angular dependence of real targets. They also had to simulate the Doppler effect, the slight frequency shift caused by relative motion between radar and target. German radar operators were trained to recognize Doppler signatures, and sophisticated sets could measure them directly. British engineers developed circuitry that introduced minute frequency modulations into the retransmitted pulses, creating artificial Doppler shifts consistent with the speed and heading of the phantom formation. It was electromagnetic forgery of extraordinary precision, every detail crafted to withstand expert scrutiny. And always there was the risk of exposure through operational error. A mistimed transmission could reveal the deception immediately. If a moonshine station transmitted before receiving the German radar pulse, the echo would precede the original signal, a physical impossibility that would instantly alert operators to artificial interference. If two stations accidentally transmitted overlapping phantoms, the formation would appear with impossible density, obviously false. Coordination protocols were therefore rigid and rehearsed endlessly. Each station operated on a strict transmission schedule, synchronized with bomber stream routes calculated to the minute. Communications between stations used secure landlines, avoiding radio that might be intercepted. Mission orders were distributed by motorcycle courier in sealed envelopes, opened only hours before operations commenced. The security architecture around Moonshine was as sophisticated as the technical system itself. Recognizing that the deception's value lay precisely in its invisibility, the moment the Germans understood what was being done to them, countermeasures would follow within weeks. The psychological burden of maintaining this secrecy fell heavily on the operators. They could not share the satisfaction of success with comrades outside their unit. They could not write home about the work that consumed their days and nights. They could not even celebrate among themselves with the boisterous camaraderie typical of RAF squadrons, because the operation was too sensitive for loose talk, even within secure facilities. They worked in isolation, their contribution to the war effort known only to a handful of senior officers and intelligence staff. Some found this anonymity liberating. The work itself was reward enough. The knowledge that their technical skill directly translated to bombers returning safely, crews surviving to fly again. Others struggled with the absence of recognition, the feeling that they were fighting a war that would never be recorded, that their role would be erased from history by classification stamps and redacted documents. They were right to worry. When the war ended and memoirs were written, monuments erected, the radar deception would barely merit footnotes. The operators of 80 Wing would fade into obscurity, their names forgotten, their achievement reduced to technical abstracts in classified reports that would remain sealed for decades. The Luftwaffe's response to the mysterious decline in interception effectiveness was shaped by institutional culture and strategic priorities that made adaptation difficult. By doctrine and temperament, the German Air Force valued aggressive initiative, technical superiority, and operational flexibility. These were the qualities that had delivered victory in Poland, France, and the Low Countries, that had made the Luftwaffe a symbol of German military prowess. But these same qualities became liabilities when confronting a threat that was invisible, technical, and systematic. The Luftwaffe High Command, the Oberkommando der Luftwaffe, preferred solutions that involved better aircraft, more experienced pilots, or bolder tactics. They were less comfortable with the slow, methodical work of signals intelligence, with the idea that the air war might be won or lost by technicians adjusting dials in underground rooms rather than by aces dogfighting over Berlin. This cultural bias manifested in how the Luftwaffe investigated the interception problem. Resources flowed toward aircraft production and pilot training, not toward comprehensive analysis of radar vulnerabilities. When technical officers raised concerns about anomalous radar returns, they were often dismissed by operational commanders who trusted their pilots' instincts over abstract technical analysis. There was an element of pride involved, an unwillingness to admit that German radar, which had performed brilliantly in 1940 and 1941, might now be compromised by British countermeasures. The narrative that the Luftwaffe preferred was one of British desperation, crude jamming deployed to compensate for inferior aircraft and tactics. This narrative was comforting, consistent with German assumptions about enemy capabilities, and fundamentally wrong. It prevented serious investigation into whether the radar returns themselves might be manipulated, whether the British had developed deception capabilities that went beyond simple jamming. There were exceptions. Individual officers who grasped that something unprecedented was occurring. Major Wolfgang Falk, a night fighter ace and tactical innovator, submitted reports as early as March 1943 describing interceptions that made no sense, formations that his ground controllers swore were present, but that his airborne radar could not detect, contacts that behaved consistently on ground scopes but dissolved into static when approached. Falk suspected systematic deception and requested a comprehensive technical investigation. His reports reached Berlin and were filed, analyzed by technical staff who concluded that atmospheric interference and British jamming could account for most anomalies. No systematic deception capability was identified because the analysts were looking for evidence of known techniques: chaff, decoy aircraft, brute force jamming. They were not looking for retransmitted echoes because such a technique had not been anticipated in German doctrine. The analysis was competent but constrained by imagination, a failure not of intelligence but of paradigm. Meanwhile, British intelligence watched German responses with clinical interest, mining signals intercepts for evidence that the deception had been detected. R.V. Jones personally reviewed summaries of Luftwaffe communications, searching for key phrases that might indicate comprehension. References to false echoes, retransmitted signals, coordinated deception. The intercepts showed frustration, confusion, declining confidence but not understanding. German controllers complained about unreliable radar, about formations that disappeared, about atmospheric conditions that made interpretation difficult. They did not complain about British deception operations because they did not recognize them as such. This lack of comprehension was itself intelligence gold. It meant the operation could continue, that the advantage could be sustained through the critical summer months when Bomber Command was ramping up operations against German industrial targets. The strategic implications were profound. The radar deception contributed to a broader erosion of Luftwaffe effectiveness that manifested across multiple domains. Night fighter losses increased as crews, frustrated by phantom chases and vectored into flak zones by confused controllers, took greater risks to achieve intercepts. Pilot morale declined as the invisible enemy proved more elusive than British bombers. Operational tempo suffered as commanders, doubting their radar intelligence, delayed scrambles or held fighters in reserve, waiting for visual confirmation that often came too late. And all of this occurred while RAF Bomber Command intensified its campaign, exploiting the window of reduced interception risk to strike deeper into Germany, hitting synthetic fuel plants, ball-bearing factories, marshalling yards, targets that would have been prohibitively costly to attack without the cover provided by moonshine and mandrel. The deception did not win the air war by itself, but it tilted the balance at a critical moment, buying time for Bomber Command to build strength, for American daylight bombing to achieve scale, for the cumulative pressure on German industry to reach unsustainable levels. By August 1943, 6 months into the operation, the cumulative statistical evidence was undeniable. Bomber Command loss rates over Germany had declined from 5.7% in March to 3.9% in August. a reduction that translated to over 300 aircraft and 3,000 aircrew preserved. German night fighter claims, cross-referenced against actual RAF losses, showed a discrepancy that could only be explained by fighters engaging phantom targets or wasting fuel on fruitless pursuits. Luftwaffe operational reports increasingly referenced technical difficulties and adverse atmospheric conditions without specifying details, bureaucratic language that concealed institutional bewilderment. And the deception held because it remained invisible, because the Germans never made the cognitive leap required to recognize that their most trusted instruments had been turned against them. They saw what they expected to see, interpreted anomalies through familiar frameworks, and missed the fundamental truth that the British had discovered how to make radar lie. And in doing so, they had claimed the electromagnetic spectrum as British territory, invisible and unchallenged. The autumn of 1943 brought new challenges and new adaptations to the radar war. The Luftwaffe, unable to identify the source of their difficulties but unwilling to concede defeat, began deploying will-to-sow tactics, freelance night fighting in which single-engine fighters patrolled over bomber targets, visually hunting aircraft silhouetted against flames and searchlights. This tactic bypassed radar entirely, relying on visual acquisition and pilot initiative. It was effective in its brutal simplicity but limited in scope. While the Dessau fighters could only engage bombers that reached their targets and could only operate over well-defended cities where fires and illumination made visual acquisition possible. The tactic offered no defense against bombers crossing dark countryside or attacking peripheral targets, and it exacted a terrible toll on the fighter pilots themselves, who flew single-engine aircraft at night without sophisticated instruments, navigating by dead reckoning and moonlight, landing on makeshift strips with minimal guidance. Attrition was savage. Nearly 30% of Wild Sow pilots were killed or injured in operational accidents unrelated to combat. But the deployment of Wild Sow forced British planners to adjust. The radar deception was most effective when German defenses relied on radar vectors to position night fighters ahead of bomber streams. If the Germans were reverting to visual tactics, Moonshine's value declined. British response was characteristically adaptive. Rather than abandoning the deception, they expanded it, using phantom formations not merely to draw fighters away from real bombers, but to exhaust German defenses, forcing premature scrambles that wasted fuel and fatigued pilots. A moonshine-generated formation approaching from the North Sea would trigger mass scrambles, pulling Wild Sow fighters to altitude and dispersing them across sectors. By the time the phantom dissolved and German controllers realized the deception, fuel reserves were depleted, organization was fragmented, and the actual bomber stream, approaching from a different vector, could penetrate defenses with reduced opposition. The deception evolved from pure misdirection to resource attrition, a technique that exploited German doctrine requiring immediate response to perceived threats. Simultaneously, the technical evolution of moonshine accelerated. Engineers at the Telecommunications Research Establishment developed improved delay circuits using mercury delay lines, tubes of liquid mercury through which electrical pulses traveled at acoustic speed, providing microsecond precision timing without the drift problems of electronic delay circuits. These devices were temperamental, requiring careful temperature control and mechanical isolation from vibration, but they offered timing stability that previous systems could not match. Deployed to coastal stations in September 1943, the mercury delay systems enabled more complex deceptions, overlapping phantom formations that appeared to merge and separate, simulated evasive maneuvers that mimicked bomber defensive tactics, even false electronic emissions that suggested jamming aircraft within the phantom formations. The level of detail was extraordinary. Each element designed to reinforce the illusion that what German radar detected was real, tactically coherent, and worthy of immediate response. The intelligence supporting these operations also reached new levels of sophistication. Bletchley Park cryptanalysts working with Enigma decrypts and other signals intelligence could now provide near real-time assessments of Luftwaffe dispositions, alert status, and operational intentions. This allowed moonshine controllers to tailor deceptions to specific German units and commanders. If intelligence indicated that a particular sector commander was aggressive and inclined to scramble fighters early, phantom formations would be positioned to exploit that aggressiveness, triggering premature responses. If a commander was cautious, requiring multiple confirmations before vectoring fighters, the phantoms would be sustained longer, feeding consistent false data until German fighters were fully committed. It was psychological warfare informed by intelligence, deception customized to individual enemy decision-makers, though those decision-makers never knew they were being manipulated with such precision. Yet the operation's success created its own vulnerabilities. As moonshine became routine, as operators grew experienced and confident, complacency threatened. Standard operating procedures, repeated night after night, risked becoming predictable. If German signals intelligence ever achieved comprehensive coverage of British transmissions, patterns might emerge. Timing regularities, frequency preferences, geographical correlations between transmitter locations and phantom formation positions. British security officers worried constantly about this possibility, conducting internal audits to identify operational patterns, deliberately introducing randomness into procedures to prevent predictability. Mission schedules were varied, transmitter locations rotated, even the characteristics of phantom formations were changed unpredictably. Altitude bands, formation densities, approach vectors all randomized within plausible parameters. The goal was to ensure that no pattern existed that German analysis could detect, that each night's deception appeared unique and spontaneous rather than systematically generated. It was operational security elevated to art, the recognition that in technical warfare, predictability is mortality. The winter of 1943-44 marked both the apex and the beginning of the end for the radar deception operations. Bomber Command's offensive against Berlin, the sustained campaign that RAF leadership believed might break German morale, depended heavily on moonshine and mandrill to suppress night fighter effectiveness. The Battle of Berlin, as it came to be known, was a brutal exchange of losses. German cities burned, British bombers fell by the hundreds, and the radar war became ever more sophisticated and lethal. Luftwaffe commanders, recognizing that their radar-directed tactics were failing, poured resources into alternative approaches. They deployed more fighters closer to targets, reducing reliance on long-range vectoring. They invested in improved airborne radar sets, the Liechtenstein SN2, operating on longer wavelengths that were harder to jam. They trained operators to recognize anomalous returns, emphasizing visual confirmation and skepticism toward electronic intelligence. And gradually, incrementally, they began to understand what had been done to them. The breakthrough came not from signals intelligence or technical analysis, but from simple observation. In November 1943, a German radar operator at a coastal Freya, stationed near Calais, noticed something peculiar. A large formation appeared on his scope, approaching from England, but when he compared notes with neighboring stations, the formation's position was inconsistent. Different stations reported different bearings to the same target. This should have been impossible. Multiple radar stations triangulating a real formation should produce consistent geometric solutions. The inconsistency suggested that each station was seeing a different false echo retransmitted from British coastal transmitters positioned to create plausible but geometrically impossible returns. The operator filed a report. It reached technical intelligence in Berlin, and for the first time, German analysts began to seriously consider the possibility of systematic retransmission deception. The investigation that followed was methodical and sophisticated. German engineers set up experimental radar receivers along the coast, specifically tasked with monitoring for retransmitted signals. They analyzed the timing of returns, looking for delays inconsistent with physical aircraft. They cross-referenced reports from multiple stations, searching for geometric contradictions. And slowly, over weeks of careful analysis, they reconstructed the outline of the British deception. They did not understand all of it. The coordination with Mandrell, the deliberate variation, the intelligence integration, but they grasped the essential mechanism. The British were capturing German radar pulses and retransmitting them with delay, creating phantom formations that appeared real on individual scopes but revealed themselves as false when analyzed systematically. The discovery was both humiliating and revelatory. Humiliating because it revealed that for nearly a year, German air defenses had been chasing ghosts. Revelatory because it explained so many anomalies, so many failed interceptions, so many nights when radar showed targets that never materialized. The German response was swift and comprehensive. By January 1944, new operational procedures were distributed to all radar stations. Cross-check all major formations with neighboring stations before vectoring fighters. Treat any formation that appeared simultaneously on multiple scopes with identical bearings as potentially false. Real aircraft formations produce slightly different perspectives from different observation points. Prioritize visual confirmation and airborne radar over ground-based returns. The procedures did not eliminate the effectiveness of moonshine entirely, but they degraded it significantly. British operators noticed the change immediately. Phantom formations that previously would have triggered mass scrambles now received cautious, delayed responses. German controllers waited for multiple confirmations before committing fighters, and by the time confirmations arrived, the actual bomber streams had often passed through the sector. The deception still worked, but it worked less reliably, and the margin of advantage it provided narrowed. R.V. Jones received the intelligence reports indicating German awareness with resignation rather than alarm. He had always known the deception could not last indefinitely, that eventually the Germans would develop effective countermeasures. The operation had provided nearly a year of tactical advantage, far longer than initial estimates suggested it would survive. In that time, it had saved hundreds of aircraft and thousands of lives, had contributed to Bomber Command's ability to sustain operations through the critical middle years of the war. That it was now compromised was regrettable, but inevitable. The question was, what would come next? What new deceptions could be devised? What new vulnerabilities could be exploited? The radar war would continue, but it would enter a new phase, one in which both sides understood that the electromagnetic spectrum was not merely a medium for detection, but a battlefield where perception could be manipulated, where seeing was no longer believing, and where every electronic signal carried the potential for truth or deception. The Germans had learned, finally, to distrust their instruments. And in that distrust, the British had achieved something perhaps more valuable than tactical advantage. They had introduced permanent uncertainty into German air defense, a skepticism that would slow reactions and erode confidence for the remainder of the war. The story of the radar deception, however, cannot end with its discovery and degradation. Its legacy extended far beyond the immediate tactical advantages it provided, shaping the evolution of electronic warfare and military doctrine in ways that would influence conflicts for decades to come. The moonshine operation demonstrated conclusively that electromagnetic deception was not merely possible, but strategically decisive, that a relatively modest investment in transmitter technology and operator training could offset massive investments in defensive systems. It proved that in technical warfare, cleverness often mattered more than quantity, that asymmetric advantages could be gained through understanding an adversary's systems well enough to turn them into weapons against themselves. These lessons were absorbed by military planners on both sides, and would resurface in conflicts from Korea to Vietnam to the Gulf Wars. Each time refined and adapted to new technologies, but rooted in the same fundamental insight. That perception is a vulnerability. The immediate post-war period saw intense interest in radar deception techniques. American and Soviet intelligence officers debriefed British personnel involved in moonshine, seeking to understand both the technical methods and the operational frameworks. Documents were declassified selectively, shared with allies under strict security protocols. Engineers who had developed the Mercury delay lines and timing circuits found themselves recruited into Cold War research programs, applying their expertise to new generations of electronic warfare systems. The conceptual template established by Moonshine, intercept enemy signals, analyze their characteristics, retransmit modified versions designed to deceive, became foundational to electronic warfare doctrine. Every modern radar warning receiver, every electronic countermeasure pod, every signals intelligence satellite traces its lineage. Back to the principles, first operationalized in those coastal bunkers in 1943. But perhaps the most profound impact was psychological rather than technical. The radar deception had demonstrated that modern warfare was no longer purely kinetic, that battles could be won or lost in domains invisible to traditional observation. It validated the role of scientists and engineers as frontline combatants, as critical to victory as pilots or infantry. And it established a precedent that would shape military culture through the Cold War and beyond. The idea that technical intelligence and operational deception were not peripheral activities but core competencies, that understanding the enemy's systems was as important as destroying them. The organizational structures created to support Moonshine, the close integration of signals intelligence, scientific research, and operational planning, became templates for institutions like the National Security Agency, GCHQ, and their counterparts in other nations. The invisible war had proven its value, and it would never again be relegated to secondary status. For the German Luftwaffe, the experience of radar deception left scars that transcended tactical failure. The realization that their most trusted technology had been systematically compromised for months undermined confidence in a broader sense. If radar could be deceived so thoroughly, what else might be false? The discovery came at a moment when German forces were under pressure across all theaters, when the narrative of technological superiority was already fraying. It contributed to a creeping pessimism among technical personnel, a sense that the initiative had shifted permanently, that German innovation was now reactive rather than proactive. Post-war interviews with Luftwaffe veterans frequently mentioned the radar confusion of 1943 as a turning point, the moment when they began to doubt not just specific systems, but the entire premise of German technical dominance. It was a psychological blow delivered by physicists and engineers, bloodless but devastating. The individuals who executed the deception largely faded into obscurity. R.V. Jones published his memoirs decades later, Most Secret War, in which Moonshine received a chapter, though many operational details remained classified. Some of the operators of 80 Wing went on to careers in telecommunications, radio engineering, academic physics. Others returned to civilian life and never spoke of their war work, even to family, bound by Official Secrets Act restrictions that outlasted the conflict by decades. A few received awards, medals presented in private ceremonies, citations that mentioned technical services without elaboration. But most received nothing beyond the knowledge, private and unshareable, that they had fought a war the world would never see, in a domain most people did not know existed. They had saved lives through mathematics and electronics, through precision and discipline, and their reward was anonymity. Perhaps that anonymity was fitting. The radar deception worked because it was invisible, because the enemy never knew they were being deceived. In a sense, the operators themselves became ghosts, present but unseen, effective because forgotten. And yet, in the classified archives, in the technical reports and operational logs preserved in government repositories, the record endures. It documents in dry bureaucratic prose what was actually a triumph of imagination and execution. The realization that radar could be made to lie, that electrons could be marshaled into deception as easily as destruction, that the invisible battlefield was as real as any terrestrial front. The radar trick that fooled the Luftwaffe for months was more than a clever ruse. It was a preview of warfare's future, a demonstration that the next century of conflict would be fought not just with bombs and bullets, but with signals and spectra, with information and misinformation, with technologies that made seeing and knowing fundamentally unreliable. The operators of Moonshine stood at the threshold of that future, though they could not have known it. They adjusted their dials and watched their scopes and broadcast phantom formations into the German night. And in doing so, they helped win a war and invented a new way of fighting that would shape every conflict to come. To understand the full scope of what the British achieved with radar deception, one must examine the infrastructure that made such operations sustainable, not just the transmitters and timing circuits, but the organizational and human systems that maintained operational security, adapted to changing circumstances, and integrated technical capability with strategic intent. This infrastructure was itself an innovation, a prototype for how scientific intelligence could be operationalized at scale. At the apex sat the Air Ministry's Intelligence Directorate, coordinating between research establishments, operational commands, and signals intelligence agencies. Below that, a web of specialized units, the Telecommunications Research Establishment developing hardware, 80 Wing deploying and operating it, RAF listening posts monitoring German responses, cryptanalysts at Bletchley Park providing intelligence that informed each night's deception plan. The coordination required was extraordinary. Every bomber command mission necessitated a tailored deception plan, designed hours before takeoff based on the latest intelligence. Planners had to know the bomber stream's route, altitude, and timing. They had to know which German radar stations would detect the formation and at what ranges. They had to position moonshine transmitters to create phantoms that would draw German fighters away from the actual route. They had to coordinate mandrel jamming aircraft to create coverage gaps in the right locations. And they had to do this every night, often for multiple simultaneous operations, with operational security so tight that even the bomber crews themselves did not know they were being protected by electromagnetic deception. The system functioned because roles were clearly defined. Communication channels were secure and redundant, and everyone involved understood that a single error, a mistimed transmission, a compromised frequency, a security breach could unravel months of effort. Personnel selection for these operations emphasized technical aptitude and psychological stability in equal measure. Operators needed the intellectual capacity to understand complex electronics and the temperament to perform repetitive, precise tasks under conditions of isolation and stress. Many were recruited from universities, young men and women with degrees in physics or engineering who might otherwise have pursued academic careers. Others came from commercial radio, amateur wireless operators whose hobby had prepared them for military signals work. They underwent intensive training, weeks of classroom instruction in radar theory, hands-on practice with transmitter systems, simulated missions where they had to respond to rapidly changing scenarios. Only those who demonstrated both technical proficiency and operational discipline were cleared for moonshine work. The standards were high because the margin for error was non-existent. The psychological toll of this work, though different from combat, was real and cumulative. Operators worked in isolation, often underground, divorced from the visible war. They never saw the bombers they protected, never met the crews whose lives depended on their precision. Their successes were abstract. Loss rate statistics, intelligence reports noting German confusion. They had no tangible connection to outcomes, no narrative thread linking their efforts to strategic victory. Some found this liberating, preferring the clarity of technical problems to the chaos of combat. Others struggled with the disconnect, questioning whether their work mattered, whether anyone would remember or care. Unit commanders recognized this and worked to maintain morale through small rituals, informal briefings that connected deception operations to broader campaign objectives, occasional visits from senior officers who emphasized the strategic value of the work, careful attention to living conditions and off-duty welfare. The goal was to sustain performance over months and years, to prevent burnout in personnel who were doing work that was simultaneously critical and invisible. Security protocols around moonshine were draconian. Personnel were forbidden from discussing their work outside secure facilities, even in vague terms. They could not tell family or friends what they did, where they worked, or why their assignments mattered. Mail was monitored. Phone calls were restricted. Leave was carefully controlled to prevent concentration of personnel in locations where they might be observed or targeted by German intelligence. These measures were not paranoia, but pragmatic recognition that the operation's value lay in its secrecy. If the Germans had identified moonshine stations as high-value targets, if they had bombed the transmitter sites or assassinated key personnel, the entire capability would have collapsed. So the stations were camouflaged as routine signals facilities. Operators traveled in civilian vehicles without military markings, and even within the RAF, knowledge of moonshine was restricted to those with operational need. The organization functioned as a secret within a secret, visible only to a handful of senior officers and intelligence staff who understood both its technical basis and its strategic implications. This organizational model, highly specialized, tightly compartmented, closely integrated with intelligence, became a template for post-war technical operations. When the Cold War demanded capabilities for signals intelligence, electronic warfare, and strategic deception, military planners looked to the moonshine example. They saw what could be achieved when scientists and soldiers collaborated seamlessly, when operation security was treated as seriously as technical performance, when innovation was encouraged within disciplined frameworks. The infrastructure that supported the radar deception became, in a sense, more influential than the deception itself. It demonstrated that technical warfare required new organizational forms, new relationships between military and civilian expertise, new definitions of what constituted frontline service. The men and women of 80 Wing never stormed beaches or flew combat missions, but they were combatants nonetheless, fighting a war that most of their contemporaries did not know existed. And the institutions built to support them would outlive the conflict, evolving into the agencies and commands that would wage the invisible battles of the nuclear age. The winter of 1944 brought a curious epilogue to the moonshine operation. Even as German defenses adapted to the radar deception, even as cross-checking procedures reduced its effectiveness, British planners discovered that the mere threat of deception had become a weapon in itself. German controllers, now aware that returns might be false, hesitated before committing fighters, wasted time on verification protocols, second-guessed their assessments even when confronting legitimate targets. The psychological impact of having been deceived proved as valuable as the deception itself. Trust, once broken, could not be easily restored. Every radar return was now suspect, every formation potentially phantom, and that suspicion introduced delays and indecision that Bomber Command exploited ruthlessly. British operators adapted their tactics to leverage this uncertainty. Rather than creating elaborate phantom formations, they began introducing subtle anomalies into real radar pictures, brief false echoes that appeared and vanished, formations that seemed to split or merge unpredictably, contacts that exhibited slightly impossible behavior. These were not intended to deceive in the traditional sense, but to amplify doubt, to make German operators question what they were seeing, even when they were seeing truth. It was deception as psychological warfare, using the enemy's awareness of previous deception to undermine confidence in present observation. The technique was elegant in its economy. It required less power, less coordination, and less risk of exposure than full-scale phantom operations. Yet it achieved meaningful tactical effects by exploiting the cognitive vulnerabilities created by earlier deception. Intelligence from Bletchley Park confirmed the approach was working. Decrypted Luftwaffe communications showed controllers explicitly discussing whether formations were real or British tricks, debating whether to scramble fighters, requesting multiple confirmations before issuing vectors. Decision cycles slowed, response times lengthened, and in the brutal arithmetic of air warfare, minutes mattered. A bomber stream that gained 5 minutes of uncontested transit could disperse before fighters engaged, could reach target altitude before flak opened up, could increase survival probability by percentage points that translated to dozens of aircraft preserved. The psychological legacy of moonshine thus extended its operational value beyond the point where the technical deception itself remained effective. The Germans had learned to distrust their radar, and that distrust became a permanent handicap, a tax on their defensive efficiency that persisted until war's end. This phase of the operation also revealed something profound about deception as a military tool, that its effectiveness is not purely technical, but fundamentally cognitive, rooted in how humans process information and make decisions under uncertainty. The moonshine deception worked not because German radar was inferior, it wasn't, but because German doctrine assumed radar was reliable. When that assumption was shattered, the entire decision-making framework built upon it became fragile. Operators who had once trusted their instruments implicitly now questioned every return. Commanders who had once issued vectors confidently now demanded verification. The system did not collapse. German air defense remained formidable through 1944, but it lost the reflexive speed that had made it so lethal in earlier years. And that loss was directly attributable to the realization that their most trusted technology had been comprehensively compromised. R.V. Jones, observing these developments, noted in his personal diary that the radar deception had achieved something rare in warfare, a strategic effect that outlasted the tactical capability that produced it. Even after the Germans understood the mechanism and developed countermeasures, the psychological impact lingered. It was as if the British had planted a seed of doubt that grew into institutional paranoia, a permanent skepticism that degraded German effectiveness more thoroughly than any jamming system could have. Jones recognized this as a template for future operations. That technical deception, properly executed, could reshape enemy doctrine and psychology in ways that persisted long after the specific technique was countered. It was a lesson that would inform intelligence operations throughout the Cold War. The understanding that the goal of deception was not merely to trick, but to undermine certainty, to make the enemy doubt his senses, to introduce friction into his decision-making at a level where no technical solution could remove it. What intelligence assessments often missed, but operational crews understood instinctively, was that Moonshine's effectiveness depended not just on electronic wizardry, but on the psychological state of the men operating the equipment. The Moonshine. Operators, typically wireless operators or specially trained volunteers, flew the same dangerous missions as their colleagues, faced the same flak and fighters, endured the same hours of freezing darkness over hostile territory. But they carried an additional burden: the knowledge that their deceptions might be drawing enemy fighters toward other RAF aircraft. Every phantom formation they created was a tactical gamble, potentially saving some crews while inadvertently endangering others. The training emphasized this moral complexity without dwelling on it. Operators were taught to think systematically about defensive reactions, to anticipate how German controllers would redistribute their forces in response to phantom threats. They learned to coordinate their deceptions with actual bomber routes, creating diversions that pulled fighters away from genuine targets rather than toward them. But the mathematics of aerial combat were inherently chaotic. You could never know with certainty whether your electronic phantoms had saved lives or cost them. Some operators found this uncertainty liberating, feeling they were contributing meaningfully to the war effort. Others struggled with the ambiguity, haunted by questions about unintended consequences that could never be definitively answered. Post-war interviews with Moonshine crews revealed a common psychological pattern. Many described a peculiar sense of detachment that developed over time, a way of thinking about their work that emphasized the technical challenge over the human stakes. They spoke of painting pictures on enemy radar screens, of conducting symphonies of electronic deception, metaphors that transformed lethal combat into abstract performance. This cognitive distancing was perhaps necessary for psychological survival. To operate effectively, you had to focus on executing the deception rather than imagining the consequences. But it also represented something deeper about the evolution of warfare itself, the way technology creates psychological distance between combatants, allowing people to wage war through layers of abstraction that obscure the human cost. The crews also developed a fierce professional pride in their work. They were pioneers in a new form of combat, inventing techniques as they went, learning through trial and error what patterns were convincing and what revealed themselves as artificial. There was creativity in this work, an element of artistry, in crafting deceptions that were psychologically plausible. Some operators kept informal notebooks documenting successful patterns, sketches showing how phantom formations should evolve across time to create convincing narratives of tactical intent. These were not official documents. They were personal, Records of a craft being invented in real time evidence that even in mechanized warfare, individual skill and judgment remained essential. The technology was remarkable, but it was human ingenuity that made it effective. While Moonshine aircraft painted phantom formations across German radar screens, a parallel battle raged in the invisible realm of signals intelligence and cryptanalysis. Bletchley Park's codebreakers provided continuous feedback on German reactions to deceptions, decrypting Luftwaffe communications that revealed how controllers interpreted radar contacts, what verification procedures they employed, where they remained vulnerable to manipulation. This intelligence loop was crucial. Without it, Moonshine operations would have been conducted blind, unable to assess effectiveness or adapt to countermeasures. The electronic deception and the cryptanalytic intelligence formed a symbiotic system, each enhancing the value of the other. The decrypted traffic revealed details that shaped operational planning. When German communications showed controllers discussing specific verification protocols, Moonshine tactics were adjusted to exploit gaps in those procedures. When traffic indicated that certain radar stations had been upgraded with new equipment, operations were planned to avoid or specifically test those installations. The intelligence was sometimes maddeningly incomplete. Cryptanalysts could not decrypt every message, could not always provide timely information before missions launched. But over time, patterns emerged that gave British planners a sophisticated understanding of how German defenses functioned at a cognitive and procedural level. One particularly valuable insight came from decrypted training documents that revealed how German radar operators were taught to identify false contacts. The documents included specific criteria, certain combinations of behavior and characteristics that suggested electronic deception. Armed with this knowledge, Moonshine operators could deliberately violate those criteria, creating deceptions that would pass German screening procedures. It was intelligence jujitsu, using the enemy's own countermeasures against them, crafting lies that were sophisticated enough to defeat skeptical analysis. The Germans, training their operators to be more discerning, had inadvertently provided a roadmap for more effective deception. But the intelligence war cut both ways. German signals intelligence was formidable, and there were constant concerns that they might intercept British communications discussing Moonshine operations or detect the transmissions from Moonshine equipment in ways that would reveal operational patterns. Radio discipline was strictly enforced. Crews were forbidden from discussing the equipment over radio circuits. References to Moonshine in operational orders used elaborate code phrases. Debriefings were classified at the highest levels. The technology itself was designed to minimize distinctive signatures. Transmissions were kept brief, frequencies varied, power levels calibrated to mimic natural radar returns rather than obvious electronic warfare. Security and operational effectiveness existed in constant tension, each constraining the other in ways that required careful balancing. The most profound realization from the intelligence perspective was how thoroughly the war had become a contest of information systems. Victory in the air war no longer depended primarily on who had the fastest aircraft or the most powerful bombs, but on who had better information about enemy positions, intentions, and capabilities, and who could more effectively deny or distort that information for their adversaries. Moonshine was one element in a vast ecosystem of electronic warfare, cryptanalysis, deception, and counter-deception. The bombers and fighters remained essential, but they operated within an invisible infrastructure of signals and codes and electronic phantoms that increasingly determined the outcome of engagements. Warfare was becoming informatized, and the participants understood they were witnessing a transformation that would only accelerate in future conflicts. By mid-1944, what had begun as an experimental capability had been absorbed into RAF doctrine. Moonshine was no longer a special technique employed by a handful of trained specialists, but a standard element of bomber operations, with procedures codified in training manuals, equipment installed on aircraft across multiple squadrons, and dedicated planning cells at Bomber Command headquarters. This institutionalization represented both success and transformation. The innovation had proven valuable enough to become routine, but in becoming routine, it lost some of the flexibility and creativity that had characterized early operations. The doctrinal integration required formalizing what had initially been intuitive and improvisational. Staff officers had to write procedures for situations that had never been systematically analyzed, translating the experiential knowledge of veteran operators into instructions that could be followed by newcomers. How many Moonshine aircraft should support a raid of a given size? What formations should they simulate? At what point in the mission should deception begin? These questions, once answered through on-the-spot judgment by experienced crews, now required standardized answers that could be incorporated into mission planning. The process of formalization inevitably sacrificed some tactical nuance for the sake of teachability and consistency. Training became more systematic but also more constrained. Early Moonshine operators had learned through experimentation, trying different approaches and developing personal styles. New operators went through structured courses that taught proven techniques but discouraged deviation from established patterns. The advantage was reliability. Every operator reached a minimum standard of competence quickly. The disadvantage was reduced innovation. Fewer operators developed the kind of creative insight that had driven early tactical evolution. It was a familiar dynamic in military organizations. The techniques that succeed through individual brilliance eventually become standardized procedures executed by average performers, effective, but no longer exceptional. The institutionalization also created bureaucratic momentum that became difficult to redirect. Equipment procurement locked in specific technical designs, making it harder to adopt new approaches that would require different hardware. Training programs established curriculum that persisted even after tactical conditions changed. Planning procedures assumed certain capabilities and timelines that shaped how Moonshine could be employed. By late 1944, there were proposals for more sophisticated deception techniques that went unexploited because implementing them would have required disrupting established systems. The very success of Moonshine in becoming a standard capability had made the system less adaptable to new opportunities or challenges. Yet this institutionalization also represented a kind of victory. The fact that radar deception had become sufficiently reliable and valuable to warrant permanent integration into doctrine validated Jones's original vision. It demonstrated that electronic warfare was not a temporary expedient, but a fundamental dimension of modern combat. Post-war air forces would inherit this understanding, building electronic warfare into their organizational structures from the beginning rather than treating it as an afterthought. The lessons learned from Moonshine's journey from experimental innovation to doctrinal standard would inform how military organizations approached technological innovation for decades to come. The importance of early experimentation, the value of rapid feedback from operations, the need to preserve adaptability even as capabilities become institutionalized. As Allied forces pushed into Germany in early 1945, the character of the air war changed fundamentally. German fighter defenses, devastated by fuel shortages and pilot losses, no longer posed the systematic threat they had in earlier years. Bomber Command's need for sophisticated radar deception diminished accordingly. When the enemy lacks fighters to vector onto intercepts, phantom formations lose their tactical relevance. Moonshine operations continued, but with less frequency and intensity. The equipment remained installed, the operators retained their training, but the operational tempo slowed as the broader strategic situation made the capability less critical. The question naturally arose, had Moonshine been worth the investment of resources, training, and operational risk? Quantifying the effectiveness of deception is inherently difficult. You cannot measure bomber losses that did not occur, cannot count fighter interceptions that were delayed or abandoned. But post-war operational analysis attempted systematic assessment. By comparing loss rates during periods of heavy Moonshine use versus periods without deception, controlling for other variables like weather and target selection, analysts estimated that radar deception had reduced bomber losses by approximately 5 to 8% across the campaigns where it was employed. That seemingly modest figure translated to hundreds of aircraft preserved, thousands of crew members who returned from missions they might otherwise not have survived. The psychological impact on German defenses was harder to quantify, but no less real. Interrogations of captured German radar operators and controllers confirmed that the deception had introduced systemic uncertainty into defensive operations. Controllers described becoming more hesitant to commit fighters, more likely to wait for additional confirmation, more skeptical of radar contacts generally. This hesitation translated to slower response times, which operational analysis correlated with reduced interception rates. The Germans had not become incompetent. Their technical capabilities remained high through 1944, but they had become more cautious, less confident in their sensor data. That degradation in defensive efficiency was a strategic effect that persisted even after specific technical countermeasures had been implemented. Perhaps the most significant finding from the post-war evaluation was how effectively Moonshine had leveraged relatively modest resources for outsized impact. The equipment was not particularly expensive. The training required was measured in weeks rather than months, and the operational deployment added minimal weight or complexity to bomber missions. Yet the tactical effects were substantial and sustained. This efficiency would become a model for future electronic warfare. Capabilities seek high return on investment by exploiting cognitive and doctrinal vulnerabilities rather than attempting to overmatch enemy capabilities through brute force. Jones noted in his final assessment that Moonshine had demonstrated something important about asymmetric warfare, that a well-designed deception targeting specific vulnerabilities could achieve effects vastly disproportionate to its technical sophistication or resource requirements. The evaluation also acknowledged limitations and failures. There were missions where Moonshine had been ineffective or counterproductive, instances where phantom formations had drawn fighters toward real bombers rather than away, occasions where German operators had recognized deceptions and adjusted tactics to exploit British overconfidence. The technology had matured, but it never became infallible. More significantly, the Germans had adapted their defenses in ways that reduced Moonshine's effectiveness over time, proof that any military innovation eventually encounters countermeasures. The key was not to create unbeatable systems, but to maintain an innovation cycle that stayed ahead of adversary adaptation, a lesson that would resonate throughout subsequent decades of electronic warfare development. When the war ended and classified programs began their gradual declassification, Moonshine emerged as a case study that would be examined by military strategists, intelligence professionals, and technology developers for decades. The operation offered lessons that transcended its specific technical context, insights about deception, cognitive warfare, and the relationship between technology and human decision-making that remained relevant as the character of warfare continued to evolve. Jones himself would lecture on Moonshine at intelligence schools throughout the 1950s and 60s, using it to illustrate principles he believed were fundamental and enduring. The first lesson was about the primacy of understanding adversary psychology and doctrine. Moonshine succeeded not because British technology was superior, German radar was excellent, but because British intelligence understood how Germans would interpret and respond to what their radar showed them. The deception exploited gaps between technical capability and doctrinal flexibility, between what the enemy could theoretically detect and what they were organizationally prepared to recognize. This suggested that effective deception required as much social science as physical science, as much insight into human cognition as electronic engineering. Future intelligence operations increasingly reflected this understanding, treating adversary decision-making as a system to be analyzed and exploited. The second lesson concerned the relationship between deception and trust. Moonshine's most lasting effect was not any specific tactical victory, but the erosion of German confidence in their radar systems. Once deceived, the Germans could never fully trust their sensors again, even after implementing countermeasures. This permanent degradation of trust represented a strategic effect that outlasted the specific technical capability that produced it. Modern military doctrine reflects this insight. Deception is valued not just for immediate tactical gains, but for long-term psychological impacts that degrade adversary, effectiveness across multiple engagements. The goal is not merely to win individual battles, but to undermine enemy confidence in their ability to perceive battlefield reality accurately. The third lesson: address the evolution of warfare toward information-centric operations. Moonshine represented an early example of warfare where victory depended less on destroying enemy forces than on controlling what the enemy knew and believed. The bomber crews who survived because German fighters chased phantoms were saved not by superior firepower, but by superior information warfare. This prefigured a broader trend toward conflicts where information dominance, the ability to see clearly while denying the enemy accurate perception, became as important as traditional military capabilities. The precision-guided munitions, network-centric warfare, and cyber operations of later decades all built on foundations laid by operations like Moonshine. Finally, the operation demonstrated both the power and limitations of technological solutions to strategic problems. Moonshine had been brilliantly effective within its domain, but it could not substitute for broader capabilities. The bombers still had to reach their targets. The crews still needed courage and skill. The industrial capacity to sustain losses still mattered. Technology was an enabler, a force multiplier, but not a replacement for comprehensive military capability. This balanced perspective, appreciating innovation while maintaining realistic assessment of its limitations, became increasingly important as technology's role in warfare continued to expand. Jones himself warned against technological determinism, the belief that superior equipment guaranteed victory. Moonshine succeeded because it was part of an integrated system that included intelligence, tactics, training, and industrial production. The lesson was that military effectiveness emerged from synthesis rather than any single component, however sophisticated. In the decades since 1945, as electronic warfare evolved from pioneering experiments to a fundamental dimension of military operations, Moonshine remained a touchstone example. It represented a moment when human creativity leveraged technology to achieve effects that seemed almost magical, making entire formations of aircraft appear and disappear at will, manipulating enemy perceptions with electromagnetic phantoms. But more than technological achievement, it demonstrated how deeply warfare had become a contest of perception and cognition, where the battle for minds was as crucial as the battle for territory. That insight, crystallized through the experience of phantom bombers deceiving German radar in the night skies over Europe, would shape military thinking into the 21st century and beyond.